I appreciate everybody for tuning in and for inviting me to be on this list of talks. I appreciate it. So what I'm going to talk about today is the influence of CRP and national scale coordinated management on northern bobwhite. The crux of what I'm going to get into, though, is CRP more effective in landscapes that are currently being managed for bobwhite? And so this study was the brainchild of Tom Daly and James Martin. Um, and so they brought me on as a postdoc to help them set it up and analyze it. And Molly Foley, who also works for NBCI, was huge for data management and GIS work and stuff like that. And we also had a lot of help from all the state coordinators that were involved in this study. So I want to give a shout out to them as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is show you data that you've probably seen before. So this is relative abundance of bobwhite from BBS data going back from 1966 to about 2016, but I've stopped it in 1985 because that's when the first Farm Bill with CRP came out. So what I did was I took this historic data from 1966 to 1985 and I projected it forward just based on what was happening then. So this is kind of the status quo scenario. So basically, if CRP had never been implemented or if it has no population level effect, this is kind of the trend that we would see. And then when we superimpose the real data on it, you can see that it does still follow that downward trend. So I guess the short story here is that CRP did not reverse the decline of bobwhite. And it's important to note that that wasn't the goal of the program, but it is a pretty ubiquitous nationwide program that puts a lot of land cover out that is beneficial to bobwhite. So there were some reasonable expectations for the CRP to have a kind of a range-wide effect, but we see that that's not really happening. So why is that? Why has CRP not reversed bobwhite declines? Again, there's a lot of it out there. This was as of February 2019, about 23 million acres. And a lot of that acreage, although not the kind of the most dense parts of it, but a lot of that acreage does overlap bobwhite, northern bobwhite range. And we know that there are field level benefits of CRP. So if you were to measure habitat quality or even the number of bobwhite in this green CRP field compared to the at the pasture field outlined in red, then you would see better bobwhite habitat in the CRP field and probably more birds in the CRP field. And there's a lot of literature that describes this local kind of field level effect. And this is super important because without this field level effect, then we wouldn't have any, positive expectations of this program. So we know that CRP at the field level is good for bobwhite and other grassland birds most of the time. But we know less about whether these effects permeate across a landscape. And so this question was one of the main ones for my dissertation, which was on the landscape scale effects of the Kentucky Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program on bobwhite and other grassland birds. So on the left, you see the study area, and each of those black polygons is a CRP field. And so it's very dense. There's 100,000 acres implemented in about 2 years in these 8 to 10 counties. And we saw a positive landscape scale effect on bobwhite density. So on the right, the numbers of bobwhite increased, which is a stark contrast to the kind of national decline. And we saw we modeled this effect directly. So we saw a direct effect of landscape scale percent grassland, which is that CRP or CREP. And we saw positive influence on population growth. And this is what this contour graph is showing. What we also did was we estimated how much of the landscape actually matters to a bobwhite population. Landscapes, just like habitat, are species specific. So even though we might delineate a landscape on the left here as some 20-kilometer radius circle or whatever, to a bobwhite, not all of that matters. So what we did was we estimated how much of that mattered, and this is a visual representation of what we got from this modeling. And so our result was that greater than 5% of this landscape needs to be encrept to meet Kentucky's population goals. So the CRP can have local and landscape scale benefits to bobwhite. So again, why haven't trends in bobwhite across the range not gone up in response to CRP? Well, one thing about the Kentucky crep was that it was very dense, and that most of the time CRP is not like that, as far as I know. And so another approach potentially is a more targeted approach where we plan where we put CRP or where we put similar programs to CRP based on kind of what's going on in the landscape. And so this is kind of where this study stemmed from. And so the National Bobwhite Conservation Initiative, and particularly the Coordinated Implementation Program, is set up really well to answer this question of, does CRP do more for bobwhite in landscapes that are already being managed for them? So the CIP, Coordinated Implementation Program, is a landscape scale approach to bobwhite management. So there are 19 participating states, so it ranges across the bobwhite range, and there's a study design here. So there's a focal area and a reference area. So a focal area is greater than 1,500 acres managed for bobwhite. The reference area is similar ecosystem, but no bobwhite management beyond what was already going there. So we have this pretty good design here, a paired design across 19 states that we can look into. And so there's this program-wide protocol for monitoring bobwhite habitat, and monitoring habitat management. So this sets up well for this study. There are also CRP contracts in both reference and focus areas, so we can compare the effects of CRP in both reference and focal areas. And the amount of CRP around these areas varies across states and sometimes within state. So not only can we compare, basically we can compare how increasing amounts of CRP affect bobwhite in both reference and focal landscapes. So here's our general study design here. And again, the main question is, does CRP have a greater impact when it's in a focal landscape? And again, focal landscapes are just areas that are being intensively managed for bobwhite. So there's a lot of different CRP practices. And so to kind of reduce the modeling load, we just categorize it into 3 different categories. Buffer practices or partial field practices, native whole field practices, and introduced whole field, or you'll see this referred to as erosion control, and this was mostly CP1. So the states outlined in gray, or shaded in gray, are the ones that are participating in this study, and you can see all the different focal and reference areas highlighted in red. So there are 9 participating states, 12 focal landscapes, 9 reference landscapes, 836 spring count locations, and 239 fall covey call survey locations. So we're looking at both breeding season and non-breeding season count data. Surveys were conducted for up to 6 years, up to 3 visits per year. So it's a pretty robust data set that we have. We developed a statistical model that accounted for the observer ability to detect birds based on how far away the bird was, calling rate of the bird, random geographic and temporal variation, and missing data. Again, we're estimating the appropriate landscape size for bobwhite in both spring and fall. We're estimating the effect of focal area, and we're estimating the landscape effects of CRP, And we're estimating the interaction between the focal area effect and CRP practices. Okay, so let's jump into the results for breeding season. So first, what is the kind of range-wide effect of the focus area approach? So all else being equal, there's about a 78% chance that a focal area would have a greater number of males per point than a reference area. So that's demonstrated here by the kind of box plot on the left. So one thing to note is that there is a lot of uncertainty with this, and it's driven mostly by a few states. Missouri has showed a really strong effect of focal area. But overall, it is a positive effect. So what is a landscape to a breeding bobwhite? So what I have here is a figure of relative importance of a land feature on the y-axis and distance in kilometers on the x-axis. So as you increase in distance, you see the importance of a CRP field declines pretty drastically. So a field that, you know, is right next to the population is really important at 1. If it's 1 kilometer away, it's about half as important as the field that's right next to it. And if the field is 2 kilometers away, it's basically like it's not even there to that particular group of bobwhite. So this is how the importance of CRP kind of diminishes the further away it gets from a focal population. So to demonstrate this visually, let's do an example here where if you look at the top left, say this is the landscape that us as managers were assigned to take care of or manage. And all the different polygons are CRP. And we have a bobwhite population in that red circle. So if you go below that, you see that there's a new black square there. So we signed up maybe a big landowner, and the total CRP in that whole landscape that was increased was a 11% increase. But if you take into account what actually matters to that bobwhite population in the red circle, you go over to the right here, and you see most of that landscape is now gone because basically it doesn't register with that population. So even though we added 11% in our area to that particular bobwhite population, it was no benefit. It was not close enough, basically. So this is kind of an example of why this type of stuff matters. Okay, so now let's look at the actual effect of CRP in context of the coordinated implementation program. So in reference landscapes, these buffer practices or partial field practices only had a 42% chance of a positive landscape scale effect on bobwhite breeding season abundance. The native whole fields had a 37% chance of a positive effect. And these introduced whole field practices had a really high chance of positive influence on bobwhite. And I'll get more into that later. It's a really high chance of effect, but the actual effect is small. So in focal landscapes, what I'm going to do is compare, compare to the reference landscape. So the buffer practices had a 97% chance of a greater, i.e. more positive landscape scale effect relative to the reference areas. So another way to say this is that there was a 97% chance of an increase in effectiveness for these practices, okay? And so same story for the native whole field practices. There's a 100% chance of increased effectiveness in a focal area versus a reference area. And in the introduced whole field, there's only a 15% chance because it was already pretty effective. So now what I want to do is go into the magnitude of those effects. So what I'm going to show you is a sequence of contour figures. And the way I like to interpret these is kind of pick a direction and draw a line across it, right? So on the y-axis, we have average distance from a focal point in kilometers. And on the x-axis, we have acres. And what this line is showing is that if all your acres were at an average of 1 kilometer away and you increase from 200 to 600, this is what the change in density would be. And so density, males per acre in this case, are the actual contours on the line. So at 200 acres, your density is about 0.02. And if you add 400 acres of these not whole field practices, you see that it's still, your density is about 0.02. So what this is showing is that there's not really an influence of these buffer practices and reference landscapes. And you can do the same thing, but going vertically, where you say, okay, what if I have 600 acres and it's all 1 kilometer from a focal population, but then I move it further away to all of its 2 kilometers from the focal population? How does the, how would density change? And in this case, it doesn't really change at all, because again, there's not much of an effect here. But if we were to have these buffer practices in focal landscapes, you see a much stronger effect of adding acres and putting acres closer to a focal population. So for instance, if we have 200 acres and it's all 1 kilometer from the bobwhite population, the estimated density would be 0.1 males per acre. If we added acreage to get up to 600, and it's still all 1 kilometer from the focal population, then that density goes up to 0.5. So it's a really strong increase as you either increase the number of acres or put the same number of acres closer to the focal population. Okay, so now looking at whole field native practices in reference landscapes, kind of the same story as the partial field, is that even if you increase acres, the density doesn't really change. And if you put acres closer to the focal population, again, density doesn't change. But in focal landscapes, there's a much stronger effect, right? So again, increasing acreage, increasing density. And then the whole field erosion control practices in the breeding season for reference landscapes. Remember, this was a really high chance of having a positive effect, but you see that the actual magnitude of effect here is pretty small. So increasing from 200 to 600 acres when it's all 1 kilometer gets you from about 0.04 to 0.07. So comparatively less of an increase than the native practices in the focal areas. And you see a similar effect of these whole field erosion control practices even in focal landscapes. So I guess the take home from the spring is that native practices in focal areas are much more beneficial to bobwhite than native practices in reference areas. And overall, native practices are much more beneficial than the erosion control, kind of CP1 non-native practices. Okay, so shifting to fall results here. Again, we saw a high chance of there being an overall positive effect of this focal area approach. So all else being equal, there's about a 95% chance that a focus area will have a greater number of coveys per point than a reference area. And again, this was driven mostly by a few states, and there's some uncertainty there, but we can say that, you know, there is this high probability of this happening. So what's a landscape to a non-breeding bobwhite? And you'll see that this is much different than it was in the spring. So in the spring, that line kind of just went straight down and went to 0 by the time you got to 2 kilometers. But here you see a much more drawn out relationship. So basically this means that much more of the landscape matters to bobwhite in the non-breeding season. So again, back to this example here, you can see that CRP at the bottom left that we added does register to a fall bobwhite population. And so we increase our landscape CRP amount by 11%, but to this particular bobwhite, it actually increased by 12% because it's you know, close enough to register. And if it was 5,000 meters closer, that would be a much higher percentage. Okay, so now looking at the influence of CRP in context of SIP in the fall. Similar story. Buffer practices, native whole field practices, pretty low chance of a positive effect on non-breeding bobwhite, but a high chance of a positive landscape scale effect of the introduced field on bobwhite. What's different in the fall is that there was less of a chance of increase in effectiveness of partial field practices compared to the spring. But again, the native whole field practices had a much higher effectiveness in focal areas than they did in the reference areas. And again, not much of an increase in effectiveness of the introduced whole field because they're already pretty effective in the reference landscapes. Okay, so looking at the magnitude, partial field practices in the non-breeding season reference landscapes. Okay, so on the y-axis, notice that the scale is different because we're looking at a much larger area now. So it goes from about 2 kilometers away to 12.5 kilometers away. But you see that if everything is at 2.5 kilometers away, as you increase acreage, the density actually goes down because there's not much of a positive effect of partial fields on non-breeding bobwhite in reference landscapes. Similar to focal landscapes, there's not much of a positive effect, and you can argue that there's a negative effect here. So whole field practices in non-breeding season reference landscapes, not much of an influence of increasing acreage here. In fact, a little bit of a negative increase or negative influence. But in focal landscapes, there is a positive influence at the landscape scale of whole field practices on coveys. Okay, so erosion control, reference landscapes, a slight positive effect. And similar for focal landscapes, a even smaller positive effect. Okay, so in general, I think we can conclude that the coordinated implementation program is increasing the efficiency of CRP for bobwhite, but definitely context is key. So landscape context, right, is key. So in focal landscapes, you see for example, in breeding season populations, buffer practices had a positive effect as you increase acreage and as you get closer to the focal population. But in reference landscapes, it doesn't have a positive effect even if you increase acreage or put it closer to the focal population. And there's seasonal context. So we saw kind of a shift in the effect of buffer practices on bobwhite from the breeding season to the non-breeding season. So in the breeding season, there was a positive effect as you increased acreage, but in the non-breeding season, there was a negative effect of increasing the kind of the buffer practices. So evidence that they're avoiding these areas in the non-breeding season. So potentially, you know, there could be different resources provided by these buffer practices to bobwhite in the breeding and non-breeding season. And that's something to consider and something that needs more study. Something else that was different between the two seasons was the amount of the landscape that actually mattered to the population. And again, I think this is probably a reflection of how bobwhite are moving across the landscape differently in the two seasons and how they're utilizing resources differently. Okay, so where will we go from here? Where will bobwhite go from here? I think that, you know, this study is a decent indication that we should be targeting the implementation of private land conservation, whether it's CRP or some other programs. And so this is my last slide, but just kind of a targeting framework to consider. So what I described with this talk is kind of a broad scale way to target CRP implementation or some other private land conservation implementation, where we're focusing on putting native practices in landscapes that are already being managed for bobwhite, because we see an increase in efficiency of CRP when we do that. But what we kind of need to know more about is the mechanisms of why this is happening. So how does practice type influence seasonal resource use? How does mid-contract management influence seasonal resource use? how does the landscape context, even within a focal area, influence resource use? So different land cover composition and what the CRP fields are actually next to, whether it's a hardwood forest or whether it's a row crop, how does that influence resource use? And how do all these factors translate to vital rates? I think that's going to be really important to understand. And that would help us implement a kind of a multi-scale optimization framework where at the broad scale, we can take into account landowner interest, we can take into account staffing, logistics, and stuff like population connectivity and general abundance and how that would be influenced by broad scale targeting. And then once we focus in on the landscapes we want to target, we can optimize profit for landowners based on some of the precision agriculture, the stuff that's out there now, and we can maximize benefit of CRP to Bobwhite vital rates if we understand kind of the mechanisms of how this increase in efficiency is working. So that's my last slide, and I want to acknowledge the state agencies involved here, especially the quail biologists and coordinators that kind of were key to completing this project and collecting the data and all that. The NBCI, Farm Service Agency, Rich Ivana. So I guess if you have questions, you can email me, or I'm sure that will be provided, but it's yeisjohn@gmail.com. That's YEISJOHN @gmail.com. And I'll end there.